In the waning months of World War II, as Soviet tanks rolled relentlessly toward Berlin and the thousand-year Reich crumbled into dust and ash, a select group of Nazi scientists vanished without a trace, taking with them one of history's most perplexing secrets, a mysterious device codenamed Die Glocke, the bell, a machine so technologically improbable and so shrouded in secrecy that even today, more than 80 years after the war's end, we cannot definitively say whether it ever truly existed or whether it was merely a phantom born from the desperation of a dying regime. Picture the chaotic landscape of Nazi-occupied Lower Silesia in 1943, a region deep within Poland that had been annexed into the Third Reich, where rumors swirled through intelligence networks and military bureaucracies of a weapons program so classified, so compartmentalized, that even high-ranking Wehrmacht generals and SS officers claimed utter ignorance of its existence. A project hidden beneath the mountains in fortified underground facilities where some of Nazi Germany's most brilliant scientific minds labored in absolute secrecy. Isolated from the outside world, their work so restricted that even they may not have fully understood the ultimate purpose of what they were building. The bell, according to the fragmentary testimonies that would emerge in the decades following the war, was allegedly a bell-shaped device standing approximately 9 to 10 meters in height, constructed from an unknown metallic substance that witnesses described variously as resembling liquid mercury, molten metal, or some kind of exotic alloy that seemed to defy conventional metallurgy. Housed within a cylindrical vacuum chamber, surrounded by concentric copper rings, suspended by means unknown, a machine whose operational principles seemed to violate everything that mainstream physics understood about the natural world, and whose intended purpose remained so profoundly secret that even the men and women who worked on it may have grasped only fragmentary aspects of the larger design. The origins of Die Glocke trace back to the Nazi regime's increasingly desperate search for Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons, secret devices that the regime hoped might yet reverse the tide of a war that by 1943 had already begun to slip inexorably from its grasp. And as Germany's military situation deteriorated and conventional victory became impossible, the Nazi leadership grew increasingly willing to fund maverick scientists, unconventional researchers, and outlandish proposals that promised technological miracles, granting resources to projects that in normal times would have been dismissed outright as pseudoscience or fantasy, creating an environment where the boundaries between legitimate scientific inquiry and desperate fantasy became dangerously blurred. The project was allegedly administered through the SS Main Office for Economy and Administration, placed under the direct oversight of Heinrich Himmler's security apparatus, and coordinated with various military research institutes and industrial contractors, drawing on resources extracted from occupied territories, utilizing forced labor from concentration camps and ghettos, and assembling a team of scientists whose expertise spanned physics, engineering, metallurgy, and theoretical mechanics, many of them talented individuals who had been compromised by the regime, co-opted through ideology or intimidation, or simply trapped by the machinery of totalitarian power. Among the names that occasionally surfaced in post-war interrogations and declassified documents were individuals like Dr. Walther Gerlach, a renowned experimental physicist who had shared in the Nobel Prize for his molecular beam experiments and who maintained connections with the Nazi regime despite his reservations about its ideological excesses, and other researchers whose full identities have largely vanished into the historical record, obscured by deliberate secrecy during the war, and further obscured by the chaos of the war's ending. When Nazi records were destroyed, laboratories were ransacked, and countless scientists simply disappeared or reinvented themselves in the post-war period. The actual function of the bell remained, and remains, utterly enigmatic, wrapped in a fog of speculation, rumor, and deliberate obfuscation that has only grown thicker with the passage of time. and the theories proposed to explain its purpose range across an extraordinary spectrum of possibility. Some accounts, drawing on the testimony of prisoners and forced laborers who claimed to have witnessed the device's operation, suggested that the bell was an attempt to create an anti-gravity machine, drawing on theoretical physics that was cutting-edge and deeply controversial in the 1940s, building upon certain speculative interpretations of quantum mechanics and general relativity, interpretations that mainstream physicists had largely abandoned, but which continued to fascinate certain researchers working outside the conventional scientific establishment, researchers willing to pursue ideas that conventional academia deemed unpromising or impossible. Other accounts hinted at more conventional weapons applications, suggesting the bell might have been an electromagnetic device of extraordinary power, capable perhaps of generating directed energy beams or electromagnetic pulses, a kind of early prototype for the particle beam weapons that would later fascinate military planners during the Cold War, though such devices would have required energy sources and technological capabilities that Nazi Germany, even at the height of its power, simply did not possess. Yet other theories, becoming progressively more baroque as they passed through the filter of hearsay and mythologizing, proposed that the bell was a temporal experiment, a device intended to manipulate time itself, or that it was a portal generator, or that it functioned as some kind of interdimensional gateway. Claims that bear all the hallmarks of post-war fantasy and science fiction rather than historical fact, and yet which have taken on a strange life of their own in popular culture and fringe historical circles. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that some kind of project bearing the code name Die Glocke did exist, that it consumed substantial resources, that it required dedicated facilities and personnel, that it was compartmentalized with extraordinary secrecy even by the extreme standards of Nazi Germany's classified programs, and that by the time the war ended and the victorious Allies swept across Europe in 1945, the device itself had vanished utterly, leaving behind no intact remains, no blueprints, no tangible evidence of its construction or operation, only scattered testimonies, fragmentary accounts, and an absence that would metastasize into legend. The bell's purported location was the Wenceslas mine complex near the Moravian-Silesian border, a vast underground facility that had served various military and industrial purposes throughout the war, a subterranean maze where the device was allegedly housed in a heavily shielded chamber, surrounded by monitoring equipment and guarded by SS security detachments, where the final experiments supposedly took place in the chaotic final months of the war, experiments that, according to some accounts, ended in catastrophe, in a final violent discharge of whatever energies the machine produced, a discharge that allegedly left no physical destruction visible, but rendered everything in the immediate vicinity completely and irrevocably dead. The most detailed account of the bell's operation and fate came from Igor Witkowski, a Polish journalist and researcher who in 2000 published a book called The Truth About the Wunderwaffe, which presented information allegedly obtained from declassified British intelligence documents and from the testimony of various sources, including an individual identified as Michaela Croft, a British intelligence officer who supposedly had access to post-war interrogations of Nazi scientists, and who had interviewed a man named Jakob Sporenberg, identified as a former Nazi researcher who claimed to have worked on the Bell Project, and who allegedly provided eyewitness accounts of the device's appearance, operation, and the horrifying consequences of what he described as a final, catastrophic experiment. According to Croft's notes as presented by Witkowski, Sparenberg claimed that the bell was activated on multiple occasions during the final months of the war, that it produced visible effects, including strange glowing phenomena, unusual electromagnetic disturbances, and what he described as temporal distortions, visible wavering in space around the device, and that, in one final experiment, either conducted deliberately or accidentally triggered, the machine produced a discharge of such violence that everyone in the immediate vicinity was killed instantly. Victims whose bodies bore no visible wounds or burns, but whose internal organs were apparently destroyed, cooked from within by whatever radiation or energy field the device produced, leaving behind bodies so thoroughly internally damaged that Sporenberg claimed they began to decompose with extraordinary rapidity, as though the normal processes of death had been accelerated to an extreme degree. Whether Michaela Croft was a real person or a composite figure created for narrative purposes, whether Jakob Sporenberg actually existed or was a fictional construction, whether the accounts attributed to him contained any truth whatsoever, remains hotly debated among historians, and critics have pointed out significant inconsistencies and anachronisms in Witkowski's account, suggesting that elements of it may have been embellished, misremembered, or entirely fabricated. And yet, the legend of the bell took on a life of its own, capturing the imagination of post-war Europe and America, feeding into widespread anxieties about Nazi technological advancement and the possibility that the Third Reich had possessed scientific knowledge and capabilities far beyond what the Allies had recognized, anxieties that were not entirely without foundation, given that Nazi Germany had genuinely produced remarkable technological achievements, including the V-2 rocket, advanced aircraft designs, innovations in synthetic fuel production, and cutting-edge work in nuclear physics. The disappearance of the bell itself and the disappearance of the scientists who allegedly worked on it became perhaps the most intriguing mystery of the post-war period. And what became of these researchers, whether they were captured by the Allies, whether they escaped to South America, whether they were silenced by the SS in the final days of the war, became a question that would generate countless theories, speculations, and conspiracy narratives, many of which lack any credible evidence whatsoever. The documented historical record shows that many of Nazi Germany's leading scientists were indeed captured by Soviet and American forces at the war's end, that they were subject to interrogation and debriefing, and that many of them went on to contribute to the post-war scientific enterprises of the Allied powers, a phenomenon known as Operation Paperclip in the American context, whereby German scientists were recruited to work on weapons development, particularly on missile programs and nuclear research, creating a historical irony whereby some of the same minds that had labored for the Nazi regime ended up contributing to the technological capabilities of the Cold War superpowers. Whether any scientists who actually worked on the Bell project were among those captured, recruited, or otherwise disposed of, remains impossible to definitively establish, particularly given the compartmentalized nature of the project and the deliberate destruction of records that occurred as the war drew to a close. One of the most significant pieces of evidence for the Bell's existence comes from interviews conducted by American intelligence officers with various German scientists and military personnel in the immediate post-war period, interviews in which some subjects mentioned a project code-named Die Glocke and described it in terms that aligned at least partially with the accounts that would later be publicized, though these interviews were conducted separately, without the subjects being able to confer with one another, raising questions about whether the subjects were describing genuine shared experience, or whether the legend had already begun to take form, with each new account building upon and embellishing previous testimonies. Dr. Walther Gerlach, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, was indeed captured and interrogated by American forces, and in his post-war testimony, he mentioned the Bell Project, though his account was relatively sparse on details, describing it as a project he was aware of, but with which he had not directly worked, describing it as something related to theoretical research into unusual physical phenomena, though without elaborating on specifics, a reticence that may have reflected genuine ignorance of the project's details, or may have reflected caution about revealing information that he considered sensitive even in defeat. The historical context of scientific research in Nazi Germany is crucial to understanding how a project like the Bell could have come into existence and could have maintained such extreme secrecy For the Nazi regime had created an environment in which scientific inquiry was simultaneously celebrated and controlled, where there existed genuine cutting-edge research in fields like nuclear physics, aerodynamics, and materials science, but where this research was conducted under the watchful eye of the SS and the regime's racial ideology, where Jewish scientists had been purged from the universities, where Jewish physicists who had fled Germany left behind laboratories that were repurposed for Nazi military research, and where the regime was willing to devote enormous resources to projects that aligned with its ideological preoccupations or its military ambitions. The decision to pursue weapons of ultimate destructiveness, weapons that might be beyond the reach of conventional military countermeasures, had infected the upper echelons of the Nazi regime, and Hitler himself was fascinated by stories of wonder weapons, of secret devices that might yet deliver victory from the jaws of defeat. A fascination that was cynically exploited by various military and industrial factions within the regime, each seeking to justify their continued funding and their continued importance to the war effort by proposing increasingly fantastic projects. Projects that ranged from the technologically plausible, like the V-2 rocket, to the frankly ridiculous, including various schemes to produce death rays, weather control devices, and other contraptions that violated basic laws of physics. Into this environment of desperation and fantasy, the Bell Project fit remarkably well, whether as a genuine scientific endeavor or as an elaborate hoax designed to extract resources from military budgets. The mystery of what actually happened to the scientists who worked on it, what became of their research, whether any of it survived the war, remains one of the great unresolved questions of post-war history. Some researchers have speculated that the Bell was destroyed deliberately in the final days of the war, either by German forces who wished to deny it to the Allies, or by Allied forces who discovered it and determined that its secrets were too dangerous to allow to survive, but no solid evidence has ever been produced to support such claims, and the absence of any physical remains or documentation makes such theories difficult to evaluate. What we do know is that Soviet forces reached the Wenceslas mine complex in the spring of 1945, that they conducted thorough investigations of the facility, and that they produced detailed reports of what they found, reports that were kept classified for decades, but which, when finally declassified and translated, made no mention whatsoever of any device resembling the Bell, described as finding only conventional mining operations and some military facilities, suggesting either that the Bell had been destroyed or relocated before Soviet arrival, or that it never existed in any physical form at all. The American side of the mystery is equally murky, for American forces also investigated various German scientific facilities in the closing weeks of the war, and American intelligence officers conducted thousands of interviews with German scientists and military personnel. Yet the documents that resulted from these investigations and interviews remain partially classified to this day, which has only fueled speculation that information about the Bell has been deliberately suppressed, hidden away in government archives. A theory that, while dramatic and cinematically appealing, lacks any credible supporting evidence. The legend of the Bell continued to grow throughout the 1950s and 1960s, feeding into post-war anxieties about Nazi technological sophistication and into broader Cold War concerns about secret weapons development. And it was during this period that various books and articles began to publicize the story, each new account adding details, embellishing previous narratives, and gradually transforming what may have started as a fragment of truth into a full-blown historical legend surrounded by layers of fiction, speculation, and deliberate mythologizing. In the 1970s and 1980s, as Cold War tensions escalated and both the United States and the Soviet Union pursued increasingly exotic weapons concepts, the Bell story experienced a renaissance of interest, for it seemed to offer a precedent for the kind of revolutionary weapons concepts that both superpowers were investigating, suggesting that Nazi Germany had been working on similar projects decades earlier. That the technological frontier being explored by Cold War military planners was not without historical precedent, a notion that added both credibility and mystique to the Bell legend. The figure of Igor Witkowski looms large in modern discussions of the Bell, for his book, despite its controversial elements and disputed sources, became the definitive popular account of the Bell's history, synthesizing various earlier testimonies, presenting a coherent narrative, and offering specific details that captured the imagination of readers and researchers. And whether Witkowski was uncovering genuine historical truth, or whether he was constructing an elaborate historical narrative from fragmentary and unreliable sources, remains a matter of intense debate among historians and researchers. What is undeniable is that the legend of the Bell has captured the popular imagination in a way that few historical mysteries have. Inspiring books, documentaries, internet forums dedicated to its investigation, and countless theories about what the device actually was, what happened to it, and what became of the scientists who worked on it. And this enduring fascination tells us something important about human psychology and our attraction to historical mysteries. Our desire to believe that history contains hidden depths, that there are secrets waiting to be uncovered, that the official historical record may be incomplete or deliberately falsified. The scientists who allegedly worked on the Bell, whoever they actually were, existed within a context of tremendous moral and practical complexity, for Nazi Germany was a regime of unspeakable evil, a state that had committed industrial-scale genocide, that had plunged the world into a war that killed tens of millions, that had built a society upon racial pseudoscience and systematic dehumanization. And yet, individual scientists within this regime were not monolithic in their commitment to its ideologies or their willingness to participate in its crimes. Some were true believers in the Nazi cause. Some were coerced through various mechanisms of pressure and threat. Some were simply trying to survive, trying to continue their scientific work within the constraints of an oppressive system, trying to avoid being conscripted into the Wehrmacht or the SS. And the question of moral responsibility, of complicity, of the extent to which scientists working for the Nazi regime bore responsibility for the regime's actions, remains one of the most difficult and contested questions in the history of science and ethics. Whether the Bell Project, if it genuinely existed, was being pursued with military destructive intent, or whether it was a more abstract scientific inquiry into fundamental physics, or whether it was something else entirely, we may never know, and the absence of definitive evidence means that the historical record will likely remain incomplete, contested, and open to multiple interpretations, a gap in history that will continue to attract speculation and investigation for as long as historical study continues. What we can say with confidence is that the post-war world was fascinated by the possibility of Nazi wonder weapons, that this fascination was not entirely irrational, given that Nazi Germany had indeed produced genuine technological innovations, and that the story of the Bell became a lightning rod for broader anxieties and curiosities about the nature of scientific progress, the ethics of scientific research in wartime, and the possibility that history might contain secrets more profound and more strange than the official record acknowledges. The scientists involved in the Bell Project, real or imagined, were caught between the demands of the regime, the possibilities offered by cutting-edge physics, the realities of a global war, and perhaps their own curiosities about the fundamental nature of reality, and what they discovered, what they built, what happened in those secret underground chambers may be a question that history will never fully answer, leaving us instead with a mystery that speaks to our fascination with hidden knowledge and to the enduring human capacity to believe in the possibility of secrets waiting to be uncovered in the ruins of a fallen empire.